Jesus studied in the synagogue with the scribes and rabbis as a young boy. This was custom for Jewish boys to learn and memorize the Torah. Jesus also spent a lot of time, as well as taught, in the synagogues as an adult. In Matthew 4:23 through 25, it records, "And he went through all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan." The Old Testament can be divided into 3 sections in Judaism. The Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the books of Moses. The prophets and the writings. Jesus regularly quoted his beliefs according to these books of the Old Testament. He often quoted the Torah. As an example, we'll look at the temptation of Jesus. He says, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." He's recorded saying this in Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4. This was a reference to the scripture in Deuteronomy 8:3 found in the Torah. He says, "And again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." You can find this in Matthew 4:7 and Luke 4:12. This he said in reference to the scripture in Deuteronomy 6:16, also found in the Torah. And lastly, during this temptation of Jesus, he says, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." You can find that quotation in Matthew 4:10 and Luke 4:8. This was also a reference to Deuteronomy 6:13 found in the Torah. So if Jesus regularly quoted the Torah, that would be more evidence that he would be Jewish. In Mark 1:21 through 28, we can see that Jesus went with his disciples. The scripture quotes, "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent, and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, 'What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him.' And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. In Luke 4:16 through 21, the scripture records, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.' And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" As you can see here in this scripture in Luke 4, it says, he came to Nazareth, as was his custom. He went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So it was normal that he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. And then it says he stood up to read. This meant that the scribes or the rabbis approved of him reading of the scroll. Then, if you look down where it says, he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Where he sat was a place of honor. He sat in the Moses seat. This was called the Moses seat because the reader was taking Moses' place by reading the words of Moses out of the Torah. Here in Mark 3:1 through 6, you can see he comes to the synagogue again. And again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus. This is talking about the scribes. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger and grieved at the hardness of their heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. You see, what was going on here was a typical competition of churches. The Pharisees were upset because Jesus had garnered so much attention that the crowds were following Jesus instead of coming to the synagogue. This affected their reputation. This affected the amount of stuff brought into the synagogue. Overall, it definitely affected their ministry plans, their lifestyle, and what people thought of them. They might also have been insecure without having the same power or authority to heal the sick and cast out demons.